All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like we have a fair amount of people and ready to go. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lauren Burnham, and I am the Assistant Director here at the American Swedish Historical Museum and co-chair of the lecture series. I would like to thank you all so much for joining us for our second installment of the New Sweden Legacy Lecture Series, which has proven to be extremely popular. So we're very, very glad that everyone could take time this afternoon and join us for our next lecture. This series consists of 3 virtual lectures, 1 per month that we had in January, this month in February, and next month in March, and concludes with a final in-person lecture and brunch here at the American Swedish Historical Museum in April. Thank you to all of our sponsors because of their support, we were able to provide this as a free program series to the public, and the lectures will be made available on the American Swedish Historical Museum's YouTube channel as a resource for future scholarship. I have a few Zoom reminders for today's program, and then it'll turn it over for a word from today's sponsor. We ask that you please keep yourself on mute during the duration of the lecture to minimize background noise. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature and type them in. And after the lecture, we'll open to Q&A session. During that time, you can also use your raise hand feature, and the moderator will let you know when you can unmute and ask questions directly. Finally, as mentioned, this program is being recorded, and a link will be on our YouTube channel where you can find today's lecture and past lectures, and that link will also be emailed to you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill Eaton, a representative from today's sponsor, the Finnish American Society of the Delaware Valley, for a message about their organization. Thank you, Bill.
Hello, everyone. The Finnish American Society of the Delaware Valley was founded in 1978 to provide a cultural home to Finns, whether here for a year to study or 5 years to work in the life sciences or chemical industry or whatever, as well as Finnish Americans who may have immigrated, started a family, descended from more recent immigrations, or whether their great grandparents came during the Great Migration, the 1850s to the 1920s. It's hard to keep up culture here in the US, so our project is to maintain that here in the Delaware Valley. We don't have a big, gorgeous building like the Swedes do in South Philadelphia. We're a little bit the little brother in the whole equation here, but we're very appreciative of what the Swedish Museum does to maintain Finnish traditions, whether the Marimekko exhibition a couple years ago, the current sauna exhibition, which I hope is on everyone's list, but also culturally keeping Finns in the loop. Finland didn't exist until 106 years ago, 107 years ago, 108 years ago. Finland was, before being part of the Tsar, part of the Swedish realm. So during the time of the New Sweden colony, Finns were just Swedes. They would have had Swedish passports if there were such a thing as a passport. So while some of them spoke Finnish, some of them also spoke Swedish, but they came from that eastern province. Um, Finns who had come in that Great Migration were sort of not at the highest rung of American society. So in 1938, when the 300th anniversary of the coming of Finns and Swedes was becoming important, the Finnish population gave to the population of the US a wonderful monument in 1938, sculpted by Väinö Aaltonen, who was the most prominent Finnish sculptor. That monument currently stands in Chester, Pennsylvania, but Chester is not the city it once was, and upkeep has been a problem. Our main project in recent years has become moving that monument to ideally Governor Prince Park in Tinicum Township. So we've taken that as our mission in recent years, and we're making great progress on that. We feel that it absolutely notes that early Finnish settlement. The Finns were terribly proud that Finns had actually played an important role in the formation of the U.S. And then the focus on John Morton, that a Finnish American was extremely prominent, as you'll hear much more about today, in the founding of the American experiment. So Finns were able to take great pride in that. And this lecture series, this lecture particularly, is a wonderful way to note that Finns have played an important role here in the U.S. Um, I will drop in the chat. Jay will talk further about some recent research on the uh, DNA evidence of John Morton's Finnish roots. I'll drop that in the chat. That's available. We also are not a 501c3. We're a very small organization, but we are a component, a chapter of the Finlandia Foundation National, and they are handling the tax deductibility of donations. If anyone is interested in supporting our monument project, I'll drop that in the chat. And I, of course, will drop my email in the chat if anybody has any questions for me about us. Me ollaan hirveän onnellisia, että me voidaan tukea tämän päivän esitys. Jay on erittäin hyvä tutkija ja opettaja, ja me ollaan onnellisia, että voidaan osallistua tänään. Thanks to everyone, thanks to the museum, thanks to the Swedish Colonial Society for maintaining a focus on this terribly important part of American history. I'll turn it back to you now. Thanks.
All right. So I am happy to introduce our speaker for today, Jay Smith. Jay is a public historian, researcher, and archivist who holds a bachelor's degree in history from Westchester University and a master's degree in public history from Temple University. Between 2018 and 2023, Jay was an archivist at the Chester County Archives, where he preserved the historic records of the Chester County government, assisted researchers in the public research room, and developed educational content and programming. Today, he is a board member for the Media Historic Archives Commission in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and he pursues independent history projects relating to local property research, colonial Chester County history, and of course, John Morton. Jay, thank you so much for being here today. I look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Brett. Thank you, everyone, for the introduction and for the invitation to join you all today to speak about John Morton, who's really become just a historical fascination of mine for the past few years. So I'm always appreciative of the opportunity to, just geek out about John Morton, especially with people who are also receptive of how cool and important John Morton is to the history of not only southeastern Pennsylvania, but also to the American story. But I'm especially excited for this collaboration with the American Swedish Historical Museum for a few different reasons. One is because I believe there's never been a more important or appropriate time to reflect on the life and career of John Morton than today. Obviously, at this point, we're, I can't believe, only a year away from the 250th anniversary of the American independence. It seems like the city of Philadelphia has been under construction for the past 2 or 3 years, and next year is the big hurrah. So now is a time to really reflect on that chapter in American history about its founding, independence, revolution, which obviously John Morton has played a role in. And then also in April of this year is going to be the 300th anniversary of John Morton's birth date. He was born in 1725, so 300 years ago would have been his birthday. So now, again, is an appropriate time to really be reflecting on what he means to this local community, to the Finnish American community, and just, America in general. But I'm also excited to be collaborating with the American Swedish Historical Museum for several reasons. So let me start sharing my screen here. One, because if anyone who's ever visited the American Swedish History Museum, they will know that you enter the building. My screen showing, I'm sorry, I jumped in a little too. It's good, cool, thanks guys. So anyone who's ever visited the American Swedish Historical Museum in South Philadelphia will know that this building, which houses the museum, is named the John Morton Memorial Building to respect the foundation or the contributions he's played in American and Finnish American history. And also you enter the building and you're greeted by these, really big, impressive paintings of these important scenes in American history, one of which is Mr. John Morton signing the Declaration of Independence. And if anyone's not familiar with John Morton, let me just state up front here, his most significant contributions to history is he was one of 56 men who signed his name to the American Declaration of Independence. That's kind of like what he's known for And the American Swedish Historical Museum honors that by one of the paintings that adorns the walls in their museum. So I'm especially excited for this collaboration. So again, thanks everyone for having me. My background is not in Swedish American history. It's not even really in the history of the American Revolution. My background is in Chester County history. For those of you not local to the area, Chester County is about 30 miles outside of Philadelphia. During John Morton's days, it would have shared a border with the city of Philadelphia. Um, John Morton, he made his career in Philadelphia. He lived there, he worked there throughout his entire life. And during his career, he served as a judge in Chester County. He was an assemblyman representing Chester County. He served as a sheriff there. Um, he would have known Chester County better than most people during his days because of all the government positions he held in that community. So it was his work in Chester County that elevated him to a position that he was ultimately involved in the American independence. Like he didn't just show up at Independence Hall and sign his name to the Declaration of Independence. He had a whole career that elevated him to that position. And a lot of that work was done in Chester County. And a lot of his, court papers and his records as sheriff are preserved at the Chester County Archives, where I worked for 5 years. So I was working with these records every day, and every day I was coming across the name John Morton based on the court writs he signed, based on the deeds he signed, based on the estate files he witnessed as a neighbor. So his name, there are thousands and thousands of records in the Chester County Archives with John Morton's name on it. And because I was being exposed to it so much, I was curious about John Morton. I was asking, who was this guy? Why do I know more about him? And anyone who's done research on John Morton knows he has a very thin paper trail. There's hardly any primary sources on John Morton, despite the fact that he was a signer of the Declaration, despite he was a sheriff, a judge, a representative. He should have a huge paper trail of primary source evidence, but he doesn't. And that's likely due to the Philadelphia Campaign of 1777. One thing you have to know about John Morton is he was the first signer of the Declaration of Independence to pass away. He died in April 1777, so less than a year after signing his name to the Declaration of Independence. The summer of 1777, the British Army, they land in northeastern Maryland and they initiate this massive ground invasion across southeastern Pennsylvania to capture the rebel capital. General Cornwallis believes if he captures Philadelphia, the revolution is going to be over. But if you look at this path they took, what's directly in between where the British Army land at the head of the Elk and Philadelphia? It's John Morton's estate. And his widow was living there at the time. And you can just imagine the fear and panic she was experiencing with the biggest military in the world on the foot of or on her doorstep, and her late husband committed treason. He signed his name to a document saying, "We are not a part of the British Empire anymore." So you can imagine how scared she was as the British Army started getting closer and closer. This is when you have the Battle of Brandywine, Battle of Germantown, Red Bank. Widow Morton does not stick around to try to make peace with the British Army. She takes her belongings and she flees across the Delaware River into New Jersey. Unfortunately for her, the British Army follow her, not her specifically, but they ultimately capture Fort Billingsport, which is the area which she fled to, and they start raiding the local community. And after the war, interestingly, she submitted a list of damages caused by the British Army. So this record is kept at the Chester County Archives. It's part of a larger series of depredation claims. During the peace negotiation, the colonies wanted to basically shame the British into better peace terms. So they wanted to present them with all the damages they caused to the local communities. And you see the items that Widow Morton said the British destroyed of the property of her late husband. It was coats and jackets, stockings, yarn, things like that. So to me, this indicates probably she took a trunk or stuff from his bedroom and took it across the Delaware River. Nowhere in this list does it specifically say personal papers, but what we do know is during the Philadelphia campaign, things were being shuffled around. There was panic, there was chaos, there was destruction. So this is what historians point to as explaining why we don't know more about John Morton. His records were lost over time. And someone who had so many important positions like he did as a judge, as a sheriff, as an assemblyman, he would have had just as much correspondence as people like Ben Franklin, John Adams. He would have had a huge library, but because his estate and his property was right outside Philadelphia during the Philadelphia campaign, it was likely lost during that period. So we just don't have records to understand and study John Morton's life. And for historians, that makes it difficult, right? Because there's nothing to look at to study his life. So they're going to instead look at people like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George. Those people had massive archives of personal papers and correspondence. John Morton, those papers don't exist. So he's kind of been, he's turned into a historical ghost. We don't know a lot about him, which is unfortunate because by making him that historical ghost, um, we miss a lot of valuable historical lessons. John Morton can teach us about what it was like being a political moderate during a time of revolution. We can learn about the social and cultural makeup of colonial Pennsylvania on the eve of a political revolution. And for this presentation, we can learn about the influence the Swedish and Finnish community had on America's founding and its early republic. So it's a shame we don't have more records on John Morton, but those records just don't exist, unfortunately. So in today's presentation, I just want to divide into three general areas. The first, probably the most interest for this audience, is his genealogy and early years growing up in southeastern Pennsylvania, where the remnants of the New Sweden Society, or New Sweden Colony, excuse me, were still very visible, and they were fundamentally influenced his formative childhood years. Then I want to pivot to his civic career. What was he doing while he was representing Chester County on the eve of a political revolution, and ultimately talk about his vote for independence. And then I want to wrap up with a conversation about, what lessons and what's the historical significance of John Morton's life. There are so many other founding fathers we can look to. Is there value in looking at John Morton, or is he just going to tell us the same story of people like Ben Franklin, George Washington? What does he have to offer us in today's day and age? So to begin, I want to go back to April 1725, the year when John Morton was born. Sometimes you'll see his birth year as 1724, and that's because there's generally confusion about the calendar change. During this period, the English world, they were still, which Pennsylvania was operating in, they were still using the old Julian calendar. The rest of the world, though, they were using the Gregorian calendar. That's the calendar we use today. People who were taking notes, and the clerks and the lawyers, they used a system of double dating. So you'll often see he was like his birth year written as 1724/25, but because we used the Gregorian calendar, we know it was April 1725. Unfortunately for John Morton, he was not dealt a very good hand to begin life. He was born several weeks after his father, John Morton Sr., passed away. So John Morton never had the opportunity to meet his biological father. And as we'll see, this adversity, though, it shaped his life. It had a profound impact on who John Morton would become, his values, his belief system, and things like that. Just want to also point out John Morton Sr.'s his estate file. I think this is a really interesting record. This is so John Morton Sr., the father of our John Morton. This is basically his will. He writes it in February 1725, February 6, 1725. There's that double dating system we're talking about. So for the Pennsylvanians, they would have understood it as February 1724, but because we use the Gregorian calendar today, we know this is February 1725. The senior Morton says he is weak of body, but of perfect mind and memory. So he understands he's sick. That's why he's preparing this will when he is. And this is one of my favorite lines of this document. I give and bequeath to my beloved wife, Mary, the use of all my lands and plantation containing 134 acres lying in Ridley, with all the use of the marsh during the time of her widowhood, unless we have a child of both our bodies lawfully begotten. He specifically included this statement knowing his wife was pregnant. He's not going to include this stipulation if he doesn't suspect, if he thinks he's dying and his wife isn't pregnant. So this time he knew his wife was pregnant with a child. He doesn't know the sex of the child. This child doesn't have a name. But right here, we have a child of both our bodies That's John Morton. We know that is our John Morton, who eventually goes on to do incredible things. But in this document, this is the very first mention of John Morton. He doesn't have a name. He's just an unknown individual, but he would go on to do incredible things. So I really like that document here. And you can imagine just the sadness of the senior John Morton. He's never going to meet this child, but he's going to give them his property. So at least they have that tangible reminder of who his father was. And also, this is that's his signature, the senior John Morton signature right there. I think that's pretty cool. And if we go down, this is an inventory of all the things that John Morton Sr. would have had in his house at the time of his death. So you can imagine the young John Morton Jr. Growing up, seeing his father's wearing apparel, all his tools, a saw book, a wheel and tin cup, a chisel, all the animals, and obviously, so he never got a chance to meet his father, but some of these things would have been physical, tangible things he could hold that would connect him to his father, who he never had a chance to meet. But again, this is a very unfortunate hand he's dealt with. And you also think about the unfortunate situation his mother found himself in. She is in the advanced stages of her pregnancy. So where is she going to turn to for support? She has to come to terms with the fact that her only child is going to grow up not knowing her father. So that was probably very emotional for her. Fortunately for them, this isn't the moment where they relied on their community of Swedish and Finnish families along the Delaware River for support. So this is a moment where John Morton's early childhood is when he realized the importance of family and community and friends and church. It is because the death of his father, they had no choice. They had to rely on their social network for support. So who were these individuals that they turned to for support? Well, here is the tax list for those individuals living in Ridley Township in 1725, the year John Morton was born. And I will say, we see Ridley Township, that's the English name of the township. Historically, this would have been known as Upland or Amos Land to kind of pin or highlight the Finnish and Swedish origins of the community. After William Penn acquired the colony, he wanted to anglicize the area. So he started changing the names of the local area, one of them being Ridley, to make it more English, to go along with his ideas for the colony. But you have people like, obviously the Mortons, the Archers, the Tortons, Hendricksons, Nicholsons, Van Cullens. These are the families that John Morton and his widowed mother, those are the families they would have turned to for support in replace of their deceased father and husband. Many of these families, John Morton's family, he could trace his ancestry back to three main branches of Finnish forefathers. The first one would have been Eskil Larsson and his son Bartle Eskilsson. They first migrated to the area in 1641. They were sent here as punishment for burning forests. Obviously, that was a very ancient practice the Finns used to clear the dense forests of Finland. They eventually took that practice, took it over to the mainland Sweden, where they started becoming a headache for Swedish officials who were trying to preserve the forest, because that's what was used for wooden ships and weapons during this age of imperialism. So they started to regulate burning forests. Mr. Eskil Larsson and his son Bartle Eskilsson, they were continuing to burn forests, so they were sent over to the New Sweden colony as punishment. Then you have Morton Mortensen Sr. and his son, Morton Mortensen Jr. They migrated here in 1654. They originally settled, I believe, in lower half of the Delaware River near Fort Trinity. But as the Dutch started to control the lower Delaware River, they started migrating up north to the area of Amos Land and Upland, to where they found families like the Eskil Larsson and Bartle Eskilsson. And then obviously the third family is going to be John Cornelius. Not too much is known about this individual family, as far as I'm aware. But these are the three families that basically married into each other, and they were the ones who formed John Morton's family tree. So he would have heard stories about these families growing up as part of the Swedish and Finnish community on the Delaware River. And like Bill mentioned earlier, there's a great new book about John Morton's Finnish ancestry that was published last year. It goes into some great genetic genealogy that kind of traces John Morton's origins back to Sweden and Finland. So if you're interested in that, I believe Bill is going to drop a link to this in the chat. So this is really interesting for those interested in Swedish or genealogy, Finnish genealogy, and things like that. During his childhood, one feature or one institution that would have been central to the young John Morton's life would have been the Gloria Dei Old Swedes Church. There was no greater influence in one's life than religion during colonial America. And for the first 8 years of his life, the young John Morton likely attended this Lutheran church where he learned how to understand the world and he came to know the importance of his Swedish heritage, Swedish and Finnish heritage. This is where he attended Sunday Mass, he celebrated baptisms and weddings, and he mourned during funerals. Most of his relatives would have also attended this church, and their Swedish identity was a really important part of this congregation because it was once heavily influenced by the Church of Sweden because they wanted to maintain a close connection to the old world. So you had pastors who were directly commissioned by the Church of England. You had Bibles and psalm books written in Swedish to kind of preserve that Swedish identity. So the Swedish identity would have been a really important part for the young John Morton's life. And it's interesting. Here is an account book entry. John Morton Sr. would have been paid after he passed away, but we know John Morton Sr. did some work on the parsonage and other Mason work later in his life, which his estate was eventually paid for in July 1725. Another very important characteristic of this community is the fact that they were constantly in the middle of rapid and constant change on the Delaware River. Between 1638, the founding of New Sweden, and 1681, the founding of Pennsylvania, the Swedish and Finnish community on the Delaware River, they were in the middle of 4 different governments. You had obviously the Swedish authorities, then you had the Dutch controlling the area, you had the Duke of York controlling the area from New York, and then obviously you have William Penn in 1681. And during each change in these governments, you had new laws being introduced, new languages from the families coming to the area, new customs, new values. So this community, they would have relied on themselves. They would have relied internally on their traditions and their values to kind of keep themselves grounded amidst all this change on the external level. One of the things they constantly had to do was they had to constantly basically defend their property rights. They received their patents in the 1640s and 1650s under the Swedish authorities, under the Dutch authorities. When William Penn came in, they had to basically prove they were the legal property owners of their property time and again during all this colonial government change. So I'd like to think that this taught the young John Morton during his very early childhood the importance of relying on community, relying on traditions to keep yourself unique among all these changing external factors on the Delaware River. And perhaps, again, because the Swedish community would have had to articulate their rights and their property rights to the English, to the Dutch, it probably instilled in John Morton the importance of defending yourself against colonial authorities. So perhaps this later inspired his career in public service. Of course, he wouldn't have been around during, the Duke of York or William Penn's original charter, but his parents would have been, his uncles, his aunts, his grandparents. So those are the people who he surrounded himself with in the absence of his father. And because those were important values to them, they likely instilled that in the young John Morton. That all came to a change in 1733. John Morton is 8 years old, and all of a sudden he is surrounded by his Finnish grandparents, his Finnish uncles and aunts and cousins and friends. In 1733, his mother, who's still widowed at this point, she marries an Englishman named John Sketchley. So in the broader context, you have the Swedish and Finnish community in the middle of this change into an English world. John Morton, he's experiencing that in his very household. He's surrounded by all these Finnish relatives, and all of a sudden now he's in the household of an Englishman named John Sketchley. So to say this was a transformative moment in John Morton's life would really be an understatement, in my opinion. And we know John Morton had a good relationship with his stepfather because he ultimately names his firstborn son Sketchley Morton in honor of his stepfather. And it would make sense why John Morton had a good relationship with his stepfather because his stepfather gave him, very important pillars in life that fundamentally changed the trajectory of his career. The first thing of importance to note is John Sketchley was a member of St. Paul's Anglican Church in Chester. So all of a sudden, again, he spent the first 8 years of his life as a, member of the Lutheran Church. All of a sudden, at 8 years old, now he's becoming a member of the Anglican Church. So this is his first exposure to diversity. He is being exposed to different viewpoints on religions and politics and languages and things like that. Later in his career, John Morton came to appreciate and really represent diversity, and this is kind of his first introduction into that world. His stepfather also gave him an education. We don't know what that education looked like, but we know John Sketchley was a founding member of the Derby Library. He basically had a paid subscription to this organization so he could borrow books, so they could buy books and share them among the local community. So a man who values education that much surely would have educated his stepson and ensured he had a good education to start out his life. And interestingly to note, when John Sketchley passes away, in his will, he leaves John Morton all of his books and his share in the Derby Library. So we know John Sketchley likely cared about his stepson's education. And most importantly, in my opinion, John Sketchley was a land surveyor. John Morton ended up being a land surveyor, so we can assume it was John Sketchley who taught Morton how to survey land, which was one of the most respected professions in colonial North America. You had to know geometry, you had to know arithmetic, but more importantly for our story, you also had to know provincial law. Surveyors were the direct go-between the rural countryside and the provincial government. Settling land was a very important process in colonial Pennsylvania, whether it was laying out a new road, laying out a new township, settling a border dispute between neighbors, dividing land left by an estate. It was a very important process. So John Morton, he would have had to learn provincial law to be an effective surveyor. And that is all thanks to his stepfather, John Sketchley. I like this. There's a few surveys by John Sketchley kept at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I always think it's so cool because like this one is from 1742. So we know John Morton, he would have been what, 16, 17, 18 at that time. I like to imagine young John Morton was accompanying his father when John Sketchley was out here surveying this property. So again, we don't have many records of John Morton, especially from his childhood, but I like to imagine this survey record from John Sketchley is kind of representative of John Morton in some sense. So in his 20s, we know John Morton, he would have made money being a farmer and surveying just like his stepfather. But everything came to a change in 1755. He's 30 years old and he's elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly, where he would spend the next 2 decades representing Chester County while contributing to some of the biggest challenges Pennsylvania has ever faced in its history. And he got a taste of that very early on because he was elected in the middle of the beginning of the French and Indian War. Most people think of Pennsylvania as, as Philadelphia, a very urban colony, but in reality, most of Pennsylvania was a very rural colony. And this is where a lot of colonists were coming into conflict with Native Americans, their French allies. So Pennsylvania was really the epicenter, or was an epicenter of the French and Indian War. And all of a sudden you have the governor of Pennsylvania and the proprietor, Thomas Penn, pictured right here. He's saying we need to defend our western border. We need to raise new taxes so we can defend ourselves. So we can raise a militia, build fortifications. Unfortunately, since Pennsylvania's founding in 1681, Pennsylvania has been dominated by Quaker politicians who steadfastly opposed to spending money on military preparations. So all of a sudden you have a huge wave of old guard Quaker politicians resigning. One of them was actually William Peters, who represented Chester County. William Peters is the man John Morton replaces in the assembly. So John Morton enters the Pennsylvania Assembly during the middle of an international conflict with the French and Indian War, but he's also entering the Pennsylvania Assembly during this monumental shift in colonial Pennsylvania politics. For decades, Pennsylvania politics was dominated by those Quaker politicians, but now you have people like Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Galloway, who are starting to get more influence because a lot of the old guard Quakers are resigning. Um, and there was a huge feud now between Thomas Penn, who was the proprietor of Pennsylvania. This was during the middle of the war. Pennsylvanians expected immediate action and immediate decision making. Thomas Penn, he resided over in England. So you can imagine it was very difficult coordinating with the proprietor of Pennsylvania when he was an ocean away. So things came to a head in 1764 when a faction led by Benjamin Franklin directly petitioned Parliament asking to revoke Penn's proprietary charter and make Pennsylvania a royal charter. John Morton, he voted on this petition and he voted in favor of it 6 different times. Sorry, I'm not used to talking this much, so my throat is getting dry. So in 1764, John Morton clearly distinguishes himself as a opponent of the Penn family because 6 different times he voted to revoke their proprietary charter. So there is huge pushback against all those people who voted in favor of revoking the Penn proprietary charter, including John Morton. One of the consequences he has to suffer is he is not commissioned to be Justice of the Peace again. John Morton was a Justice of the Peace as early as 1757. Justice of the Peace was essentially a local judge who heard civil and criminal cases, but they were commissioned by the governor. The governor was Thomas Penn's brother, John Penn. They did not commission John Morton to serve as Justice of the Peace again, probably as retaliation for supporting this attempt to revoke their charter. But something also happens in 1766. 1766, the sheriff of Chester County passes away just weeks after elections were held for this position. So there are multiple candidates who just campaigned to be Chester County Sheriff. To fill this vacancy, the governor, John Penn, has to basically nominate someone to be the new Chester County Sheriff. Who does he nominate? He nominates John Morton. John Morton never expressed interest in being sheriff. He never ran to be sheriff, but John Penn likely saw this as a political opportunity. John Morton is clearly qualified to be sheriff, but this is also an opportunity to remove a political opponent from the assembly because the sheriff had so many responsibilities. There was no way John Morton could remain in the assembly and serve as sheriff at the same time. And being sheriff would have been an incredible opportunity. Not only was it exciting, you get to travel the entire county, but it was also very financially incentivizing. There were actually tons of anti-corruption laws passed to limit the corruption of sheriffs because they were paid based on all the tasks they performed. So the more tasks you performed, the more money you would have received. And a motivated sheriff could have earned a very healthy profit. And I think this is in my opinion, one of the most interesting periods in John Morton's life because the responsibilities of the Chester County Sheriff, he would have had to travel the entire county. And at the time, Chester County was huge. It stretched all the way from the Delaware River here in the east, all the way out to the Lancaster frontier, from Maryland all the way up to the Schuylkill River. It was huge. And within its border, it was probably one of the most diverse areas in colonial North America. You also had the Finns and the Swedes right along the Delaware River. You had the Welsh Quakers. You had German Mennonites up here, Scots Irish. It was huge. Yeah. And one of his most important responsibilities was issuing court writs. The Chester County civil and criminal courts were held every 3 months. And in between those court sessions, John Morton had to travel the entire county, basically telling people, you have to show up to the next court term. You have to show up to the next court term. On average, he received 145 court writs every 3 months. So he had to travel the entire county looking for 145 people during this time. This is the time before mailing addresses, before definitive locations. All he knew was, oh, this person, they live up in Coventry Township. They live down here in East Nottingham. So his method would have been to travel to the center of community looking for people. And where would the center of the community? It would have been at places of worship like churches and meeting houses. It would have been at the local taverns. So John Morton, during his 3-year tenure as sheriff, he would have spent a large amount of time in colonial taverns, at churches, looking for individuals he had to summon to court. And what are people talking about at church and in taverns? They're talking about their lives. They're talking about politics. And think about what's happening, in the broader picture between 1766 and 1769. This is the eve of a political revolution. You have things like the Stamp Act. You have things like the Townsend Duties. John Dickinson publishes his Letters of a Pennsylvania Farmer, where he's articulating against British taxation. All these, big, broad things that are being discussed between the colonists and the British, they're being talked about in the taverns and in the churches, where John Morton would have spent so much time during his 3-year tenure as Chester County Sheriff. So John Morton, later in his career, he's identified as a political moderate, and I really think that was shaped during his time as sheriff of this diverse community filled with all different political perspectives. So there wasn't a homogenous political ideology or cultural background or religion in Chester County. You had all these communities that he would have been interacting with on a daily basis. And then, of course, he was a judge. During his time in the assembly, he would have also been serving as judge. So I think it's interesting. For those local to the southeastern Pennsylvania area, you have the 1724 courthouse in the city of Chester, which I believe is the oldest public building in the United States. This is the court bench. John Morton, he would have been spending a lot of time behind this bench because he spent about 10 years as being judge, where he would have heard civil cases and criminal cases, again, in Chester County. So the same people he interacted with as sheriff, these are the same people coming to him to talk about assault cases, fornication cases, larceny. All the problems of the community are being presented to him while he is being the judge in Chester County. And also of note, he would have in 1774 he was nominated to be he was nominated to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, which met directly across the hall from the Assembly Room in Independence Hall. So in 1774, he has an office in the courtroom in Independence Hall, and then he also has a desk over in the Assembly Room. So he would have been spending so much time in the Independence Hall, which of course at the time would have been known as the State House we know today as Independence Hall. So during this time, while he's doing all these domestic things, right? He is a legislature. He is sheriff, so he's in law enforcement, and he's a judge. He has, I think, probably one of the most impressive political resumes by the early 1770s. No one probably knows Pennsylvania law better than John Morton because, again, he was a lawmaker. He was in law enforcement, and he was interpreting the law as judge. He's doing all these domestic things while underneath the surface, there is a crisis brewing with the British Empire. Obviously, in 1765, you have the Stamp Act, which John Morton, he was one of 3 Pennsylvanians to represent Pennsylvania in the Stamp Act Congress in New York City. So he's part of this broader conversation about the relationship between the colonists and the British Empire, whether or not the British have authority to tax the colonists without representation in Parliament. Skipping ahead to 1775, I think 1775 is the most consequential year of John Morton's life because look at this timeline. In March 1775, John Morton is unanimously elected to serve as the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly. And just imagine, this accomplishment. He was born without a father in a farming community. A few decades later, he is now unanimously elected to serve as Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly. It's quite the accomplishment, but obviously he had no time to appreciate this accomplishment because there was a major crisis brewing. A few weeks later, you have the battles of Lexington and Concord break out in Massachusetts. The shot heard around the world. The British Empire has fired on British colonists. So Pennsylvania is going to play a huge role in its response. In May 1775, so just 2 months after he's elected Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, he's also elected to represent Pennsylvania at the Second Continental Congress. Another fact, as Speaker of the Assembly, John Morton basically donated the assembly room in the State House to the Continental Congress. So as a delegate to the Continental Congress, John Morton is meeting in the assembly room. He's still an associate judge on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, so he's meeting across the hall in the State House. And then the Pennsylvania Assembly, which he is the speaker of, meets upstairs. So he has 3 desks in this building. So again, I really think few people during his life would have known the ins and outs of Independence Hall more than John Morton. And think about this. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress, they commissioned an army to George Washington. So he's this crisis brewing. No longer is this just a political dispute with the British Empire over taxation, representation in Parliament. There is a war going on, and he has to basically dictate Pennsylvania's response to all of this. And all of a sudden, he's a man in the middle. He spent his entire life being this man in the middle. During his childhood, he was a part of the Swedish and Finnish community, but then he was in the middle of it because he was in an English household. As sheriff and judge, he represented all these diverse cultures and religions, representing Chester County. And once again, in 1775, he found himself in the middle. This time, he was in the middle between a very radical Congress led by people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. These were the revolutionaries. These were the individuals who there were starting to be quiet calls for independence. And on the other hand, he was the leader of the Pennsylvania Assembly. Now, what's interesting about the Pennsylvania Assembly during this time, a lot of people were resigning. People like Benjamin Franklin, they were formerly a member of the Assembly, they resigned. They didn't want to be a part of this institution because they thought their political ideologies were more closely aligned with the Continental Congress. This affected Morton's ability to do business because there was often a lack, or he did not have enough members to formally do business. So he often had to just adjourn the assembly because there weren't enough people to hold, session that day. But in the assembly, he had people like his former political opponent, John Penn, who he basically said, I understand the grievances we have with the British Parliament and the King, but let's not join these radicals in Congress. Let's basically present our problems and issues separately. John Dickinson, who was a notorious political moderate, who was very cautious and deliberate with his responses, and then Joseph Galloway, who was one of the most famous loyalists in American history. John Morton, he's directly in between these two factions as a member of the Second Continental Congress and as Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly. You can just imagine the stress that this probably put him in. Just in another timeline, let's take a look at this. In November 1775, calls for independence are starting to grow louder and louder. You have things like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So this sentiment of calling for American independence are starting to grow louder. As Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, John Morton passes specific instructions to the delegates in Congress. He's saying, you are not there to split away from the motherland. You are not there to create a new form of government. You are there to make peace and harmony with the British Parliament. In May 1776, so a few months later, Congress, a lot of delegates in the Continental Congress are fearful that they don't have the authority to basically move on independence. So the Continental Congress issues a statement saying, if a colonial legislature is not supportive of the American cause, dissolve it, ignore it, and form a new government that will support the American cause. So this is a direct challenge to John Morton's Pennsylvania Assembly, which is right upstairs. John Morton is a member of both these institutions, but Congress says if a colonial legislature is not going to support Congress, is not going to support the American cause, dissolve it, abolish it, form a new one that is more favorable to the American cause. In May 1776, John Morton, he's obviously panicked about this. A few weeks later, after Congress makes this statement, John Morton tries to gather enough representatives in the assembly to issue a response, to form a plan, a strategy to respond to this. But again, there's so few members, John Morton doesn't have enough people to issue a response. It shows the ineffective ability of the assembly to operate because a lot of its members had joined Congress instead. Then you have this thing called the Pennsylvania Provincial Committee. They are this radical group of Philadelphians who is going to take Congress's call to absolve the assembly and start to form their own form of government for Pennsylvania. This is a direct challenge again to John Morton's Pennsylvania Assembly. Then in June, obviously the big thing, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, he introduces his resolution for American independence. Now he's putting onto the table, we want the delegates of the Continental Congress to say whether or not they support American independence. And again, just imagine the stress John Morton is experiencing at this time. On one hand, he is the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly. This institution has existed since 1682. He does not want to be the last Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly deposed by this radical, illegitimate Pennsylvania Provincial Committee. So he has to think to himself, okay, do we issue new instructions to the delegates in Congress? The previous instructions said, you do not have the right to declare independence. But now John Morton has to think, do we give them new instructions to vote for independence if they choose? But then he's a member of the Second Continental Congress. So personally, he has to decide now whether or not he supports American independence. On one hand, if he supports independence, this is an act of treason. If the revolution is a failure, he's probably going to be, suffer some consequences. But if he doesn't support American independence, he's a public figure, and the public is turning increasingly radical. They are turning to vigilante justice to prosecute those who aren't supportive of the American cause, like by tar and feathering. So he's faced with these really stressful decisions. In June 1776, Speaker Morton, he passes new instructions to the delegates in Congress. And I think this is one of the most important sources we have on John Morton in terms of his political his evolution of his political philosophy leading up to his vote for independence. Because again, there are so few members of the assembly, this wouldn't have passed without his support. So Morton would have fully supported these instructions he sent to the delegates in Congress. And he's basically saying, since we gave the last instructions, a lot of things have changed. The king has basically ignored petition after petition. All of a sudden, he's hiring foreign mercenaries. All hopes of reconciliation and reasonable terms, they're extinguished. We've tried our best to preserve peace and harmony. The king and parliament are unwilling to cooperate. Therefore, we are instructing the delegates to the Second Continental Congress to concur with other delegates. Vote for independence if you choose. And again, I think this is because we know there are so few members in the Pennsylvania Assembly. Morton wouldn't have put this up for a vote if he didn't support it, in my opinion. So this, I think, is John Morton's, political philosophy towards independence as of June 1776. The famous vote for American independence comes July 2nd, 1776. There are 9 delegates to Congress from Pennsylvania. So the 9 of them will determine whether or not Pennsylvania as a whole supports American independence. 4 of them are absent. Andrew Allen, he's a loyalist. He doesn't want to even entertain the idea of independence. Edward Biddle, he's recovering from an injury. John Dickinson, Robert Morris, they eventually signed the declaration, but I think they believed independence was a bit premature. They weren't ready to declare independence yet, but they sat out. 2 individuals voted against independence, Thomas Willing and Charles Humphreys. And then obviously 3 individuals voted in favor of independence, Benjamin Franklin, James Wilson, and John Morton. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Willing, those were the more political theorists. They were the ones who firmly believed in Republican government. It's hard to say because we don't have his personal papers. It's hard to say what John Morton really believed, but based on that previous record, I think this was his last ditch effort. Time and again, he tried to petition, or he worked with others to petition Parliament and the king, but time and again, they ignored those petitions. So I think this was basically his last ditch effort to preserve representative government, to preserve his Pennsylvania Assembly. Because remember, if he didn't pass those previous instructions, the Pennsylvania Provincial Committee probably would have, pointed to that saying, why are we listening to John Morton's Pennsylvania Assembly? Because they're not willing to support the American cause. In August 1776, John Morton, he signs the Declaration of Independence. What's very interesting, in my opinion, so after he signs his name to the Declaration of Independence, the Pennsylvania Assembly, it's bare bones at this point. There's only a handful of members still joining the assembly upstairs. John Morton, though, he ensures that he still holds sessions. He wants to close out all accounts. He wants to make sure government officials are paid. He wants to make sure that the assembly is still doing everything in their power and their authority, because he believes that they still are the legitimate legislating body of Pennsylvania. But he adjourns the assembly on September 26, 1776. That is the last meeting of the Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly. 2 days later, the Pennsylvania Provincial Committee ratifies the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution, creating the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. That's the form of government that exists today in Pennsylvania. So that occurred 2 days after John Morton adjourned the assembly, because there was no one attending the assembly anymore. In October, John Morton, he does not seek election to this new legislative body of Pennsylvania. He does not seek re-election to the assembly, which is, again, kind of a joke at this point. There's no one attending. And does not seek re-election to the Continental Congress. Instead, he returns home to his Ridley Township plantation. And in January 1777, he becomes ill. A lot of historians speculate it's probably tuberculosis or another respiratory illness, which seemed to have been common among the Finns and Swedes on the Delaware River. I'm not super familiar with that, but it seems like most sources cite that was probably some respiratory illness that, again, was seemingly common among the community on the Delaware River. I like to think, you just imagine the stress he was experiencing during this period. He probably wasn't taking the best care of himself. But we know in January 1777, he prepares his last will and testament. This is probably one of my favorite records about John Morton, his will. He was someone who worked with government records his entire life. He knew language was very, very important. In January 1777, Pennsylvania is no longer a colony. It's no longer a province. It is the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Most wills being written at this time say, John Morton, Ridley Township of the County of Chester in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. John Morton, instead, he opts to say province of Pennsylvania. Again, for someone who worked with government records his entire life, I don't think this was, a mistake. I don't think he overlooked this. He did not believe the Pennsylvania Provincial Committee was a legitimate form of government. He believed that they usurped power from the assembly. So I think it's really cool that in his will, commissioners, people are swearing allegiance to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He opts for the province of Pennsylvania. And John Morton passed away in April 1777 again. He's the first signer of the Declaration of Independence to pass away. And then, of course, you have the Philadelphia campaign. His sources and personal papers and archives get lost over time. So just to wrap this all up, John Morton, he faced tremendous adversity early in his life, especially with the death of his father, having to be raised by a single widowed mother with no adult children. But he turned those hardships into an asset, and he created an incredible life for himself, his family, and his descendants. Not only did he do that, but he also, by the end of his life, contributed to the creation of a new democratic republic that fundamentally changed the world. Not bad for a boy who grew up in a rural farming community without a father. It's a true American story, in my opinion. But it's not just a feel-good story we should passively listen to. I think there are, clear historical lessons on the importance of our local communities, appreciating and understanding cultural, political, religious diversities, and being an effective representative for diverse communities. He believed in thoughtful and deliberate progress, which likely frustrated a lot of his contemporaries who were operating in a very impulsive and reactionary time period. It was a revolution, yet John Morton, he was more cautious, more deliberate with his political philosophy. And finally, to reflect on his Finnish identity, Morton's career accomplishments are a testament to the power of the close-knit community which he was raised in, which endured for decades even after the, new Sweden ceased to exist. The community endured a rapidly and changing world thanks to their collective resilience, community solidarity, and intergenerational shared values. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest John Morton's life could have been radically different. Again, he was born without a father in a rural community. It's very likely, in my opinion, he could have ended up in the county poorhouse or, living a destitute life otherwise, but he had this strong community he could rely on early in his childhood. And then obviously his stepfather was there to give him opportunities that he probably wouldn't have had otherwise. So yes, John Morton, he is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His signature is on the Holy Grail of American history, the Holy Grail of democratic government. But I believe there's an entire community of Swedish and Finnish families behind that signature. They were there taking care of Morton and his mother, and they ensured he was able to live a life that ultimately led him down the path that he could sign the Declaration of Independence and really, contribute to this new form of representative government for his community. So yeah, with that, I will be happy to answer any questions the audience may have.
All right, everyone. Just listening. I'm going to begin taking questions from the chat. Uh, Everybody, please do me a favor. If you do have any questions, direct them to the chat. After we get through those, I am happy to take individual hands up via the hands feature if you raise your hand on Zoom. So we'll start with Bill. Bill Eaton asks, is there much evidence in the personal papers of other founding fathers or provincial legislators of their impressions of Morton?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. You have a lot of these new initiatives like Founders Online from the National Archives and the was it Revolutionary City by I think the American Philosophical Society, which is quickly indexing and transcribing a lot of personal papers of other founding fathers. So through their records, we can search John Morton and see how they were communicating and interacting with John Morton. And I know he had a very close relationship with Anthony Wayne, the general who's also from Chester County. And it's really interesting. We know John Morton did not like this Pennsylvania Provincial Committee because there's a really interesting letter between Anthony Wayne and Benjamin Rush. Basically, Anthony Wayne is saying John Morton died probably because of the misery he foresaw coming from this Pennsylvania Provincial Committee. So I'm not sure about direct impressions on John Morton. I think a lot of folks respected him. He was a political ally of Benjamin Franklin. He was allies of people on all sides of the spectrum. Might have irritated some of them, especially during a revolution when partisan politics, that's kind of like the nature of it. But I think he had a lot of respect. And yeah, there's some really interesting insight into John Morton based on how he is being referenced in the letters of other founding fathers. So yeah, I'd highly recommend checking out Founders Online and a Revolutionary City. Again, they have a lot of transcribed records where you can search John Morton's name and just see how other folks were communicating about him.
Very good. Edwin Blue asks, where is John Morton buried?
Yeah, so John Morton, he is buried in the Old Swede Cemetery in Chester, which is it's the St. Paul's burial ground, but I think it's called Old Swede Cemetery. So in the city of Chester, it's unfortunate because that cemetery, like I think it was Bill Eaton mentioned earlier, unfortunately Chester is just not the city. It's a struggling city. There's some issues and it's so much history. It's probably one of the most historic cities in Pennsylvania. Yeah, it's just not in the situation to really take care and preserve that history. But he is buried in Chester in the cemetery for St. Paul's Church. St. Paul was obviously the church his stepfather was a part of, St. Paul's Anglican Church. But there's a lot of Swedes in that church because I believe it started as a Swedish church.
Very good. Doris Finelli asks, what sort of property and assets does his will mention, and did he have any heirs?
Yeah, so he had a ton of property. He made a lot of his money through his property because we think of, a politician today, oh, they make decent money. He would have made decent money as being a representative in the assembly, but most of his money would have came through his land holding. So he had a lot of land that he would have leased out to families to live there. A lot of his land was like marshland, so we would rent it to people to basically, have marshland to keep pigs and other cattle, things like that. So he did have a significant amount of land holdings, and he did have heirs. I believe he had 9 children. His
Wow.
oldest son, Major Sketchley Morton, unfortunately, later in his life, he kind of encountered some financial troubles. So he has to start selling a lot of the property his father left to him. But yeah, he did have 9 children later in life.
Holy cow. Sandy asks, how many generations, if you know, was John Morton removed from New Sweden, and were all of his ancestors Finnish and Swedish?
Yeah, so he would have been what, 3 generations removed from New Sweden? Let me see. I have his family tree here somewhere I can quickly share.
Yeah,
So let's see. These would have been the forefathers, the three main families who originally migrated. Oops, sorry. The three main families who originally migrated as a part of New Sweden. So he would have been one, two, about 3 generations removed from the New Sweden colony. But as I tried to demonstrate, just because the political entity of New Sweden went away in 1655, that community stuck together during the Dutch days, during the Duke of York, during Pennsylvania. So even though they wouldn't have lived under the title of New Sweden, a lot of their cultural identity and tradition and customs still would have existed.
very good. Very, very good. Excellent. Uh, Now, Jane Beatty asks, do we know what caused John's death? I know you had mentioned tuberculosis, correct?
Yep, I had no proof for that. It seems like one of those things. Anything you read kind of just hints at tuberculosis. Uh, and again, in the same context, they constantly say that seems to have been a common disease or a malady of the Finnish community on the Delaware River. I'm not sure if anyone else has any more information on that, but it's something you constantly see credited to his death.
Very good. And I should mention Jane Beatty, according to the chat here, does claim relation to John Morton, which is
Nice.
very, very cool.
That is
Now, our final question in the chat, Joy Peterson, when did Finland become an independent country? Did Finland war with Sweden? And Jay, if you don't know this, I'm sure Bill Eaton would know as well.
I will turn it over to Bill. He's the expert.
Finland gained its independence December 6, 1917, from Tsarist Russia during the First World War. Finland, setting aside the Four Nations hockey game a few nights ago, Finland hasn't had an active proper war with Sweden ever. Finland belonged from the 1300s to the Swedish realm. Uh, Sweden lost Finland to the Tsar back in the 1800s, and it was from the Tsar, from Tsarist Russia, that Finland gained independence 108 years ago.
Very cool. Now, it looks we have a new question. We'll take a couple more questions. Uh, LB Davis asks, "What is the name of the new John Morton book that you both had mentioned?"
So it is called The Roots of John Morton in Finland, a study in history and genetic genealogy. I'll be honest, I'm not a genealogist. I'm really, the his Finnish and Swedish genealogy is a bit outside my wheelhouse. So this is a really good, up-to-date study on all that. He uses genetic genealogy, the DNA, RNA, and all stuff like that. So if you're interested in John Morton's genealogy, I highly recommend picking up this book.
Very good. Thank you very much, Jay. So everybody, I'm going to share my screen here. If you'd all, oh, what's happening here? Can everyone see this? Nope, sorry, that didn't work. Um, we
Try
do have,
again. I think yeah.
oh,
Or
gotcha.
I can do it too. Hold on.
Yeah, if you can do that, Lauren. Uh,
Oops. Hold on. I got you though.
so,
Hold on 1 second.
so as this is being shared, Jay, I have one final question. What is the most fascinating thing that you learned in your research, you know, throughout your research about John Morton? Was anything particularly shocking to you?
It's an interesting question. Really shocking. I think what's really interesting to me is his historical memory or lack thereof. Again, I don't think anyone would have had a more impressive resume in pre-revolutionary Pennsylvania than John Morton. Again, I don't have to go through his resume again, but he held all these important government positions. He was in the middle of all these issues, the Stamp Act, First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, Declaration of Independence. He was a political juggernaut, in my opinion. Yet he doesn't have, like, there's no scholarship on him because of a lack of primary source evidence. So I'm just really interested in the creation of his historical legacy because in my opinion, he should be well documented like Benjamin Franklin and all those other founding fathers. Yet he's a ghost. There's nothing to know about him, and that just goes to talk about historians are limited, or our historical knowledge is limited to the sources we have available. And even if someone was a political icon in their days, like John Morton was, in my opinion, the historical record isn't going to show that just because there's nothing that historians can make arguments off of. So not only is he a fascinating historical figure, it just really, I think, is a good demonstration and lesson on the construction of historical memory.
Very cool. Thank you very, very much. Now we have the our special thanks up. Thank you everybody in the New Sweden Legacy Lecture Series Committee for their hard work. Do keep on the lookout for our upcoming lectures. We have our next one on March 19th. The speaker is Evan Haffley. The lecture will be on New Sweden's colonists under Dutch rule from 1655 through 1664. Our final lecture of this year will be in person. It will be on April 12th. It will start at around 10 o'clock in the morning and end around noon. The speaker will be Paul Finkelman. The lecture will be titled Peter Stuyvesant's War on Swedes and Other Lutherans. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to this presentation today. Jay, thank you so much for a wonderful and fascinating presentation. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to email us. And Jay, if you're so inclined, we'd be happy to forward them on over to you. And again, thank you everyone so much. Please keep on the lookout for our upcoming lecture events that you can sign up on our website. Thank you, everyone.